Welcome back to Restless. You've joined daring Diane, punctual Paul, and myself, Father Joseph Gill.
Faithful Father Joseph.
Oh, I like that. Faithful. That works. As together we young adults restlessly seek the face of Christ in the midst of today's crazy and mixed up world. And did you guys hear recently about the potential Eucharistic miracle in Connecticut?
I did.
Yes.
Isn't that absolutely amazing? Yeah, Thomaston, when everyone's like, where the heck is Thomaston? Way, way, way up
Litchfield
north.
County.
Yeah. Just take Route 8 and just keep driving.
South of Torrington.
Yes.
North of Waterbury. Be specific.
Do you want to give us the exact zip code?
I don't know the zip code.
Okay, that's pretty good, though. It's pretty good.
I think I'm right.
So what have you heard about the miracle? Because that's pretty wild.
I just watched a 1-minute clip and the priest was explaining. It was actually, I think it was live streamed or something. So it was him, actually at the Mass. And he said that one of the Eucharistic ministers was running out of communion hosts and that our Lord multiplied himself such that it was not necessarily necessary to go back to the tabernacle to obtain more consecrated hosts.
Yeah, I know. And that's kind of a remarkable story in a lot of ways. One is why did it happen then and there? Why did it happen to that particular Eucharistic minister? It wasn't even the priest who did that.
Yeah.
It just seems, I certainly believe it. I have no reason to doubt his testimony, but it seems random.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like why
Thomaston,
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important ever so now. A recent poll came out a couple of years ago where only a third of Catholics believe in the real presence of Christ. Why do you think that is? I mean, that's a terrible statistic.
I don't know. We recorded an episode on rationalism or something to do with that. So I think it's natural for humans to look at a consecrated host and say, well, it's kind of like if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck and swims like a duck and flies like a duck, then it must be a duck.
So
I think that's
bread,
exactly
like bread,
right. And so I think that's our modern rationalistic way of considering things, and so that's very hard to overcome for most people, for a lot of people. Well, most people, I guess, because it's 2/3 that don't.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I can't remember that poll very specifically, but I would presume that many of those people don't know the doctrine to begin with. They don't understand it.
Yes, and I wonder how many of those people are Catholics in name only who don't actually practice faith.
Yeah.
Which kind of could skew the results. Not necessarily 2/3 of the people in church on Sunday.
I think it was a Pew poll, if I'm not mistaken. But
it might be, which I think is so ironic. They're called Pew.
Oh, ha.
I mean, if it's about Christianity.
Right.
I'm sure there's a reason why. What do you think?
I agree with Paul. Certainly, you see the host and it looks like a piece of bread, so I think people are often deceived by appearance, right? And I think a lot of people struggle with the supernatural just in general, the belief. And particularly amongst Catholics, I think catechesis has unfortunately been so poor. People don't have strong knowledge of Scripture or the story of salvation, and sort of all of the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, if you really do, a solid Bible study, you kind of see all of these things like the Passover. You understand what Holy Thursday was, Good Friday, manna, like the new manna, the bread of the presence. You make all these connections and it strengthens your belief in what is actually happening at the Mass. I think it's a fundamental lack of understanding of what the Mass is, really.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But I think you guys are right about the lack of supernatural, because I think sometimes, especially when I'm teaching people, they'll kind of associate spiritual with symbolic. Mm-hmm. And the two are not the same. Right? I mean, we have a soul. It's not symbolic. It's not, just a nice symbol. Like the soul's a real thing. It has real existence. But we only think, especially in our modern world, that things that you can measure have real existence.
Yeah. I've always found it helpful the way St. Thomas Aquinas, kind of the Aquinan, the Thomistic way of looking at it, where the substance of the bread has changed, but it still maintains the accidents of bread. That's always clicked with me for some reason. So I like thinking about it in that particular way, and it helps.
But I think I totally agree. But I think one challenge in understanding that is that there's literally no parallel in the natural world. There's nothing in the entire world where the accidents stay the same and the substance changes. right? Because anytime the substance changes, if I'm going to take a log and turn it into charcoal, the accidents change as well. It looks different. It doesn't look like a log that's now something fundamentally different on the inside, right? So that's the hard thing, is that we have no analogies to use in the natural world. It's something that goes beyond our analogies.
Yeah. And that's where faith comes in, I mean, at the end of the day, it's, again, I think a solid catechesis is very helpful, and of course these Eucharistic miracles serve to bolster that faith. But, I think people tend to box God into, like, we think with our rational human brains, which are very limited, right? So it just seems impossible, but God can do the impossible, right? He creates with a word. He can do anything. And so I think you often forget that. Even good Catholics struggle,
No, absolutely.
Because you tend to form an image of God in your head that is actually not who God is.
Yeah.
It's limiting.
But you're right too, that we don't fully understand how much our materialistic culture, in the sense of like that the only thing that exists in the material world, how much that's even seeped into Catholics' brains as well.
Yeah.
And part of that too is, I think, the fact that many masses have lost the transcendent peace, right? So a lot of the churches you go to look just very, very much like a social hall. It doesn't look like there's anything truly going on here, and masses look like an entertainment piece,
Or sometimes bad entertainment.
Yeah, a lot of times bad entertainment.
Cheesy,
right?
maybe cheesy.
Right. And
I like cheese. I like the substance of cheese.
I do,
I don't
yeah.
like the accident of cheese.
Well, cheese does an accident on my guts, I'll tell you.
But you're right. I mean, honestly, the lack of reverence, right, with a lot of the Novus Ordo masses in particular, and just the, post-Vatican II, these churches were just stripped of, the altars, the altar rails, beauty, and beauty and reverence lift your minds and your hearts to God so that you can kind of, better conceive what is actually happening. Because whether you believe it or not, the transubstantiation is a fact. It's just, I think it becomes more difficult when you have sort of that lack of reverence.
Right, exactly. I was at a church recently to give a Lenten mission, and their tabernacle was off to the side, which, is...
Very post-conciliar.
Yes.
It was very post-conciliar, but the tabernacle looked like a spitball.
What do you mean? Like a rock? Like a jaggedy rock?
It was a round, jagged thing with, like, it was supposed to be rays coming out from it, but it looked like it was a spitball that was flung against the wall and had splattered everywhere. Yeah, it was very interesting.
Terrible.
Although,
It's terrible the way you explain it. I don't know if it's nice or not.
a dear friend of mine who had visited that church said it was the Eye of Sauron.
Oh, there you
Kind
go.
of his
that makes
way of
sense.
looking at it,
Yeah.
But that lack of transcendence, you look at it, it's off to the side. You got to find
Yeah.
it, search for it, and
I think peace is the key word. Like, I don't think a church necessarily has to be, like a Gothic missile shooting up to heaven, but it can be very simple, but still peaceful and transcendent.
yeah, it can be. It can be.
But some
and
of
even
them- some of
masses,
them aren't.
masses can be simple.
Oh,
and still transcendent. It doesn't
I'll
have to
take-
be Gregorian chant and all
Right.
this.
I'll take a mass with no music over mass with bad music every day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And sometimes if I know a particular church doesn't have the best music ministry, I will choose to go to its 7:30 mass or whatever because it won't irritate me.
That's fair. No, you shouldn't be irritated while you worship.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what about you personally? Have you ever doubted or struggled to believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist? Was there like a time in your life where like, I don't know? Because that could be a hard doctrine to believe in, even for lifelong Catholics like we are.
I don't know if this makes any sense, but I've had I've had like a cognitive dissonance where it's like, okay, I know this to be true, but I'm struggling. Like, I know it and I don't deny it, but I'm struggling to contemplate it.
That's fair.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe kind of the difference between head knowledge and heart knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of.
I've experienced the same thing. Yeah, there were some time in my life when I can distinctly remember being like, I know this is really Jesus, but I don't feel like it is.
Yeah.
Like everything in me is telling me it's not, but I know that it is.
Yeah. I think that's fair. Especially, as I said before, with our rationalistic mindset, we've grown up in a rationalistic world where science is separated from religion almost from birth, that it's understandable.
Yeah.
I don't think it's unreasonable to have those moments.
No, and I think that's kind of part of the necessary journey to an adult mature faith. Really, I mean, faith is deepest, I think, when it's blind. You know, when you don't have sometimes the sensory experiences where you're not like seeing the miracles, and where you're just kind of being like, Lord, I trust you only because you said it, or only because your church teaches it, and it doesn't make rational sense to me. I can't figure it out.
That's humbling. It's humiliating.
Yeah,
and
in a good way.
In a good way, and I don't think many people have that degree. I don't think a lot of people have that degree of humility.
Yeah,
because you have to be humble in those particular circumstances, and
that might be why Christ comes to us in the most humble of appearances as bread, right?
Yeah,
so that we can, because it's only really food for the humble. If you're expecting something great and grand, you're not going to be satisfied.
Right. What do you think about Tangent? What do you think about
which is another great show on Veritas Catholic Network?
Yes. I didn't do the plug this time.
No,
I usually do the plugs. Yeah.
That was me. Go on.
Right. What about churches that do the bread and wine, or the body and blood of Christ in the like the chalices?
What about it?
What do you think? What do you think about that? Do you think that helps strengthen the faith? Do you think it's unnecessary? Well, it is unnecessary. Do you think it's
so we believe in a doctrine called concomitance, which means that you believe that anytime you receive the host, you're receiving body, blood, soul, and divinity. Same with the precious blood, right? You're not just receiving one or the other. So you're right, it's not necessary. It is a fuller sign, because it's
fuller sign. What does that mean?
There's a greater sign value, right? Because sacraments, the definition of sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace, right? So there's an outward, visible, tangible reality that helps us to appreciate the inward reality of what's going on in the sacrament. So to receive a liquid and a solid helps us to appreciate and to open ourselves to the very reality of body and blood.
Right.
Now, with that said, I'm very glad that COVID killed it in a lot of parishes. And we have chosen not to bring it back in my parish, in large part because I am of the old school that we don't need an army of Eucharistic ministers giving out, this and that. And
this and that. I heard it once. One of the priests here in Stamford said, well, by the time you get to the end of the line, there's a lot of accidents in the precious blood. There's a lot of accidents.
All you need is one lady with lipstick, man.
Yeah. So, that's, but it's interesting. I know the Eastern Catholic Church, in Tinction, they have like the bowl of, they have a bowl with a golden spoon, and it's both.
They do.
The
body and the blood mingle together.
Chuck it into your mouth when you go up, and you do like a what's the thing with the pole that you go underneath? Is a game.
Limbo.
You do like a limbo stance, and then they kind of like feed you.
It does look like limbo a tad bit.
A little bit, right? Okay, yeah.
A tad bit.
Well, in Spain, they dip the host into the precious blood as well.
Oh, do they really?
Receive kneeling, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Wow. Oh, I haven't had that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be very careful.
Not the last time I went to Mass in Spain.
Oh, interesting.
I guess I was gypped.
Yeah, you have to be very careful with that, to not drip any of the Eucharistic species. Yes.
Oh, I see.
and that's part of why I don't.
Well, that's why you'll see when the priests do it, they bend over quite meaningfully over the chalice.
Right, and you need the paten, like it's right there, to prevent it from falling. Yeah. So with all of this, are you aware that the U.S. bishops are doing this 3-year Eucharistic Revival campaign?
Yes, but I don't know what the intended goal is, or the intended tactics by which they are going about this.
Well, the goal is to restore the faith in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The tactics are, well, one tactic is a giant Eucharistic Congress out in Indianapolis, I think it is, maybe. Which sounds really cool. It's like kind of like a mini like World Youth Day sort of, but for families and people of all ages, and not nearly as exotic as going into Paris, but Portugal.
Paris. Oh, Portugal.
Yeah, but they had in Paris too. But
yes, I'm going to Portugal this year
for the World Youth Day.
Yes,
nice. Are you going, Diane?
No, I'm not.
I think this is my last year that am considered a youth. When it will be held. So
well, then you could be a chaperone.
I don't want to do that. I was asked to do that in the past to Poland, and I said no.
Really?
Yeah.
Could be nothing more rewarding than helping young people encounter Christ in a foreign country.
I knew several chaperones, and it was
hard,
exciting.
Yeah. No, I've only run one international trip to Rome with teens. That was an adventure.
Yep.
Definitely. I would do it again though.
So anyway, so they're doing this big Eucharistic Adoration Festival conference.
Yeah.
Event gathering.
And we've had events in our diocese. So they've done, I think at this point, 3 or 4. And I know, Father Joseph, they've been at your parish in terms of the nights of worship. I think that qualifies as part of the Eucharistic Revival.
Oh, like
if I'm correct, right? Yeah. So it's basically a night of, they open up a parish a Saturday evening from like, I don't know what it is, 7 to 9. There is music, a talk by, because I believe that there are priests specifically assigned to travel around for this Eucharistic Revival.
Yes,
so
the Eucharistic missionary preachers.
yeah,
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
Okay.
So someone who, I guess I did Leonine for him in New York City, and the chaplain, he is part of this revival. I know that there's a couple of Dominicans who I listen to regularly who are assigned, as well as Franciscans. So I went to the first one. It was in Stamford downtown at Holy Name Parish, the Polish church, and it just, the lights were out when I got in. Candles were in the aisle. Tried not to trip on everything.
Yeah, really.
Because I came in a little bit late, but it started out with music. It looked like they had some sort of professional, or I don't know who they hired. It was more of the praise and worship. So I don't know if they've switched that up, because everyone has a different preference for worship
Yeah, you can worship
style.
in different ways.
Yeah. So it was that. And then the one that I went to, it was a CFR who gave a little homily sort of on the Eucharist. So it was an education of, of what we believe. And then it was just a lot of, more music and kind of just silent prayer time. So a couple of hours, and there were a decent amount of people. So
Well, I do think God is raising up adoration to help people to know the real presence, because and Protestants can mimic the Mass in a lot of ways, right? They can have readings and give out their version of the Eucharist, which is just bread and wine. Mm-hmm. They believe it to be just bread and wine, symbolic, right? But Protestants would never mimic adoration.
yeah.
Right, because that implies that we're actually adoring what they would see as a piece of bread, but what we know is the real presence of
Well,
Christ.
that's what they would say about
Yeah.
us. Something.
And I would say that adoration has really strengthened my belief in the Eucharist. And you don't necessarily, I think we have to be careful about, like what we were talking about. It's okay not to feel that Christ is there, but the spiritual life is not about feeling. It's really about, understanding what, like if we take Jesus for his word, right? And there's lots of biblical evidence for this. There are so many ways that you can kind of approach the true presence in the Eucharist. My own experience has just been, it's one of those things where, just like if you're starting like a running regimen, right? Like some days you're not going to feel it, but you just got to keep going, like make it consistent. And the graces that come from going to adoration, at least in my life, have been so transformational. Like I've just asked God in many ways to heal areas of my heart that I didn't think would ever be able to be healed. And it like to be raw and open with him about like, I'm not sure if you can do this, like that's what he wants. And that's where he works those like amazing transformations, right? I mean, it's, I think I had read one of the saints like compared it, sitting at adoration is like getting a sunburn, right? You don't need to feel anything or have this, even if you don't have 100% confidence that he's there, it's like you're being hit by these rays of grace. And I've certainly, it doesn't mean that you're going to walk out there and you're going to be this like totally faithful, confident, abandoned person, but it's certainly, like the spiritual life is a journey.
Well, right, it's gradual.
Yeah.
That transformation is gradual.
Yeah.
I mean, just like you can't really notice a suntan after 1 hour.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, unless you're in a tanning bed or use that spray stuff.
It might be burnt.
Or you might be burnt, in a tanning bed for an hour.
I think in the past, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, there's many whatever caveats to what I'm about to say, but I would say that among the faithful, I would say reverence in the Eucharist has gone up. But my caveat is that we live in a fairly devout bubble down here in Lower Fairfield County.
Yeah.
And so, but I think I've been to other places around the country where they're bringing back altar rails or kneelers, because most altar rails are gone, but like kneelers and more adoration. And so it seems among the faithful, it may have gone up a bit. Like the faithful.
In some respects, yes. I mean, I brought kneelers to my parish about 6 months ago.
How is that?
And it's been really positive. I would say about 25 to 30% of people use it. at Sunday Mass. My biggest struggle, to be honest, is to help people to understand the internal dispositions you need to have for the Eucharist, particularly to be in a state of grace. Because I think there's a lot of people who maybe have been taught, or maybe just have not paid much attention, but have been just kind of under the impression that the Eucharist is like, a kind of like a Protestant idea of just, it's a way of sharing fellowship, that, everyone who's there is welcome. Well, that's not what the Scripture teaches us, right? Because St. Paul in Corinthians says, if you eat the flesh and blood of our Lord unworthily, you eat and drink judgment upon yourself. And so I'm trying to impart in people that, no, confession is a necessary part of, living a Eucharistic life.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a pretty big deal.
Well, that's why we only need to go to confession once a year. It's because we only need to receive the Eucharist once a year, right?
Need. Like bare minimum.
Well, what the church asks of us is so small.
Right.
What the church asks
The absolute bare minimum requirement,
is very low.
And that was put in place back in the day when people would receive communion very rarely. I mean, it said that St. Francis of Assisi only received it 3 times in his lifetime.
Yeah.
But going back to what you said too about people not receiving in a state of grace, I think that is something that, priests should definitely be talking about from the pulpit. It's certainly something that we should know, but I found like a lot of Catholics just are not aware of that. And it's I think people also have a hard time understanding it, but that
missing Mass is a mortal sin.
Exactly.
That's one of the biggest ones. I mean, a lot of people think that they're not in the state of mortal sin because they haven't murdered. Well, they don't realize there's a lot of mortal sins that are committed by very good people.
Yeah.
Missing Mass, getting drunk, sexual sins. I was at a parish recently, another parish in our diocese, where their examination of conscience for adults skipped the 6th commandment.
Adultery?
Yeah, that's the 6th commandment, yeah.
Yeah, and that there are a lot of things that fall under. It's not just fornication. It's,
right.
lustful thoughts. It's all those things,
looking at bad images. I mean,
they don't have the little standard one?
No, they made their own, and it was like, have I tailgated somebody in traffic? And I'm like, okay, well, that, yeah, all right. Have I gossiped? Have I done this? Yeah, fine, but they totally skipped over any of the sexual things, which I can understand it being a sensitive topic, but the fact is, almost everybody's parishioners struggle with that regularly. Yeah. And if not, then they're lying about it.
Right. I think there's I don't know. I'm optimistic. Well, it's not optimism. It's understanding. I don't think people are well catechized generally.
No, that's very true.
And so they don't know. They truly don't know. I mean, maybe they wouldn't change if they did know. That's like the cynic. But maybe if they did know and they were better educated, then maybe they would.
Well, I think if they knew, there would be a choice that they'd have to make. Do I want to remain Catholic or do I want to leave? Because if you know, I mean, if your conscience is going to start bothering you about this action or that action, then you either have to change your action or somehow stifle your conscience.
Right. Well, if you understood so it goes back to, if you understood where we started this conversation, if you understand the real presence of the Eucharist and the gravity that comes with that, I think people would probably be a bit more willing to, and if they believed it and they wanted to believe it, they'd be a bit more willing to go to confession and receive on the tongue or whatever, all the really different things that you might do to increase reverence.
I mean, I've heard many stories, maybe apocryphal, but many stories of Protestant pastors who said, if I believe what you believe, I would crawl into there on my hands and knees into your church.
Yeah, well, please do.
Because please do. Yeah.
I mean, if you believe it.
One other resource, Father Mike Schmitz on Ascension Presents, he did a short video on sort of why you can't receive communion if you're not in a state of grace, and I thought it was very helpful because I hear this a lot from people of like, well, the church is just so, discriminatory against people in terms of who can receive and not, but, he was saying if you're not in a state of grace, meaning you're in a state of mortal sin, meaning you do not have sanctifying grace within your soul, the Eucharist is not medicine for the sick. It's not medicine for someone who is dead.
Right.
Okay. It's medicine for someone who is sick. And so if you're dead, this medicine is not, so
it's not going to help you.
Yeah. And I thought that was a very good way for people to kind of understand, what is going on and the fact that mortal sin separates us from God, you know? The life of grace is dead within us unless we go back to confession. And that is a grave, you know, that is...
And it causes a real reality. It's not symbolic. A mortal sin is not a symbolic death. It's a real death. There's something really died within you.
And I think it's an important caveat that, so not all grave sin is mortal sin. I think we have an obligation to go to confession if we're in grave sin to some extent. But I always encourage people, like, you can ask questions in confession and seek advice, and especially if you struggle with habitual sin, things that you're struggling with, and they'll help you. Generally.
Yes, no, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. I mean, there's always, you know, I also hear frequently from our elderly parishioners, oh, you know, I feel so guilty I missed Mass. Well, why'd you miss Mass? Because I was in the hospital. Like, that's a perfectly good reason.
Right, yeah.
Mass.
So that's a good, yeah.
But I agree. I mean, I had an RCA lesson last night, and I was talking to the candidates.
She's
in my
teaching.
class.
She's not going through it.
Yes.
Just FYI.
And I was talking to my candidates who are, you know, coming into the church, and granted, most of them, 4 of them are being baptized, so they don't need to make a confession, obviously. But for post-baptism, I just encourage them, you know, like we went through the whole examination of conscience, which I think is very important because it's, to your point, it's not just like murder. There's a lot of subcategories that fall under these sins, and I think it's just a prudent thing to do is to bring all of your sins to confession, because to your point, Paul, I'm not sure everyone understands the difference between mortal and venial sin, and also the grace of confession gives us confession gives us the grace to overcome those sins, so bringing them certainly is helpful.
Yep. And especially if you're new at confession, well, it depends on the confessor.
Yeah.
But if you can find a good confessor,
Father Joseph.
Yeah, that's
Father Joseph's a great confessor.
my line's long enough.
Right. Yeah. Don't go there. No, I'm kidding. But
no, that is important. I remember
if you find a good confessor, then it can be very fruitful. And they should be a lion on the pulpit and a lamb in the confessional, and not all are, but many are.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. You have to find a good confessor. I remember I've had plenty of ones that have said some strange things. Like, remember one time confessing the sin of gluttony. And he said, no, it's not gluttony unless you throw up.
Like, well, that's an extreme.
And I was like, it's like, well, that doesn't sound right.
Well, maybe it's a difference between a venial sin and a mortal sin.
Perhaps.
Maybe. I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not really sure. But all right, last question, because we only have a minute left. But I think we have to ask ourselves the question that's kind of an elephant in the room, is that isn't the Eucharist cannibalism, right? Because we're eating someone's body. How do you explain that?
Well, normally, I guess cannibals eat dead bodies, so we're eating the glorified and resurrected body of Christ.
Doesn't that sound worse? We're eating a
Sounds
living
better.
body. So if I eat your arm right now,
how would you
I'm not a
respond to
cannibal.
that?
Well, I've heard I don't know if this is kind of a Scott Hanism, but I've heard that we act as the bride, like Christ is our groom and we are the bride. And in order to consummate that relationship, the Eucharist is the means by which we do that on earth. And so,
so kind of a marriage parallel.
A marriage parallel, yeah. And that's how it's no marital act, but that is, in a sense, like a proxy for that.
Sure. One body entering another and bearing fruit.
Yes.
That's interesting.
I think that's a Scott Hanism.
It is.
It is.
Sounds
right?
almost like a Christopher Westism.
Yes.
It could be that too.
He's very much into the
It's the
sacramental
theology of the body type of thing.
Theology.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all
a nice
connected
thought.
to marriage. So.
Yeah,
definitely.
What do you say?
I say, and I have to be very, very clear with the language here. So the church officially defines that Christ's presence in the Eucharist is not physical. What that means is that it's not based on the laws of physics, right? So if I take a Eucharistic host and break it in half, both halves are still 100% Jesus. There's nothing in the physical world that if I break an apple or something else in half, you just don't have two apples, right? You have half an apple and half an apple. It's not a full apple. So it breaks that law of physics. It breaks the law of physics of it can be in literally two places at once, right? It can be in every tabernacle in the world, still there, right? So it goes beyond physics, what Christ's presence is. His presence is a unique way called the sacramental presence. Sacramental doesn't mean not real. It doesn't mean fake. It doesn't mean symbolic. It's a new way of being. Paul's giving me a look like
I just didn't
no
follow
idea.
that. Sorry.
So in other words, like it's not a physical, like when I bite on the Eucharist, Christ's physical body is not hurting, right? He's not, ow, stop biting me, right? And so that's why people are like, you can't bite down the Eucharist. Yes, you can bite down the Eucharist because it's going to be destroyed in your stomach acid, right? You want Christ to go through that, right? But so the reality is it's a different type of presence. This presence is sacramental, which is not less real. It's absolutely real, 100%, body, blood, soul, and divinity, but it's a new manner of being.
Yeah, I actually, there's a podcast called Godsplaining by the Dominican friars and Father Gregory Pine. He has, if you go back to 2022, around this time, I think it's Lent, he did a series on the Eucharist. So I highly suggest that because he talks about the difference between the types of presence, physical, substantial, all that stuff. So
no, I don't recommend you listen to any other podcasts other than Restless.
Dominicans are pretty good
unless it's one of the other Veritas podcasts,
like The Tangent
and Let Me Be Frank.
Let Me Be Frank. That's it. Shout out to Bishop Frank.
Yes.
Anyway.
Punny title, yes.
Sorry, yeah.
Ours isn't.
Ours is not. No, we're just Restless Zany, for zany young adults.
Zany, oh gosh.
Zany.
Still on the website.
Paul hates us, the fact that we
can
call
figure
it
out a new name.
Crazy? Insane? I don't know.
Insane. I like insane.
Insane. That's more our style. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of Restless. I hope this stirred up in your heart Eucharistic amazement. Go out and worship him at your next Mass, at your next adoration. Make sure your soul is prepared through confession to receive him with great dignity because you are receiving the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Restless. You can find us on Veritas Catholic Network, 1350 AM and 103.9 FM, and wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in next time.